Hi everyone, welcome to another Draft Broadcast Live. I'm Ned McConnell and I'm the curator here at Draft, and today I'm delighted to tell you that I'm joined by Sriwhana Spong. Shri, do you want to just turn your video on?
Oh yeah.
And say hi.
Hi.
There we go. And Harriet Middleton Baker.
Hi everyone. Hello.
Who are two artists that we will be working here at Draft with as part of our live art commissions. I'm not going to say too much about their practice now because they're going to introduce that a bit in a second, and we'll obviously talk a bit about that throughout this kind of hour-long discussion. So the live art commissions are something that we've initiated, I guess, in part in response to the kind of current lockdown and coronavirus pandemic, with the fact, taking into account, I suppose, that live work is probably put under more pressure than other artistic practices because of the need for gathering and people being together and kind of live bodies being in the same room. So they'll be delivered in 2021. We haven't got an exact date for that yet because we want to we're trying to kind of feel out how things are moving along in terms of the lockdown and the pandemic, and obviously that's kind of shifting a lot at the moment, so we're keeping an eye on that and developing things, and hopefully we'll be able to release some dates fairly soon. So the commissions are to produce new work, and it will be live work obviously, but outside of that there's not really any parameters, and we're working with 6 artists in total, so obviously Harriet and Shri, and then Apau Junior Yiadom Boaki, and Lloyd Corporation, who is Ali Isa and Seb Lloyd Rees, and then Jamila Johnson Small, who is aka last year's Interesting Negro, and Fernanda Munoz Newsom. So that makes up the whole kind of roster of what will be a really exciting program next year. So before we get into the talk, I'm just going to do a bit of an introduction into these talks. So this talk, whilst it's obviously connected to the live art commissions, is also part of our kind of live program that we've been doing in partnership with Performance Exchange, which we wanted to set up. We set up just at the beginning of lockdown because we wanted to give people who work with performance and live a kind of opportunity to still be active and talking and discussing their practice. And Performance Exchange is an organisation that's kind of trying to develop kind of cross-sector dialogue around the collecting and presentation of performance work. All of the talks have been archived on the YouTube channel. So Performance Exchange and Draft, we have a kind of joint YouTube channel, and you can find that out through our website or Performance Exchange website. And then finally, just before we get started, the format of this talk is so both artists are going to spend maybe 5 minutes or so just introducing their practice a little bit. And then the 3 of us will have a kind of a slightly broader discussion, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. So the way you do questions is there's a little button somewhere on your screen, usually towards at the bottom somewhere, your Zoom menu, that says Q&A, and you can just type your questions in there, and then at the end I can read those out and we can try and address some of those. So yeah, without further ado, I guess, Harriet, I think we're starting with you. So maybe do you want to just talk us through a little bit about your practice?
Hi, yeah. I think we're going to share some slides with you first, so we can talk it through. Yeah. Anyway, hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in on a very hot, sweaty day, and I hope you're outside rather than inside like I am. So this was a project that you can see on your screen, which was commissioned by Cell Project Space as part of their public program called Schema, which was sort of about engaging other local groups to their gallery to kind of think about audience participation and outreach and kind of building community. So Rachel Davis, the curator of that program, approached me to work on a new performance that was going to be in kind of, I think it was alongside another exhibition as well with Mathis Gasser and Angharad Williams. And so I went on a kind of journey with her to come up with this opera, which we're calling it an opera, but I don't know if real opera heads would be too happy with that name. But so the project came about because I'd already been researching the kind of classist nature of opera being this kind of hierarchical, very a kind of inaccessible format. And I thought, you know, I think maybe I was just attracted to it for that reason, because I was like, I want to, if something feels inaccessible to you, I want to dig at why it is. Although really it became less about the fact that it was an opera and more about the content and the research that I was doing. And it became a kind of way of working for me rather than a kind of a point of research in itself. So the project sort of began with an initial outreach moment for finding people to work with. So because it was always going to be a collaborative effort and it was going to be about kind of engaging with local people in the neighborhood, we made contact with a dance group called the Green Candle Company, which are a group of people who are over, I think the age group is 55, who all dance for pleasure and community and just exercise. And a lot of them are really passionate about dancing, and if some of them have danced all their lives, some of them have only just started dancing. And we put an invitation to them if they wanted to work on the project, and thankfully some of them did. So we began this project together, which was called the War Room, which began as a way of trying to unpick kind of the aesthetics of power and the aesthetics of the patriarchy, and how, you know, kind of posing the question about whether, you know, if you flip the switch, and if you had a matriarchy, would that be any better? And how can you untangle that kind of debate that we see in kind of like neoliberal feminist politics, where you get a lot of this kind of boss bitch type things, or like Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, and there's a lot of these quite I don't know, grey area questions for me regarding contemporary feminism in a capitalist society. So with the dancers and with the brilliant Helen Noir, who's an opera singer and a techno DJ who did the score, we all kind of collaborated together on building this narrative that was, oh, and I must mention as well the choreographers who were involved as well, Sister, who were brilliant. So we formed a kind of like production team and worked on this performance together in a very collaborative way with Rachel as well. And we did a lot of research into the gestures of power. So we had like workshops in which we'd look at how leaders from all kinds of organizations, like government heads of state, CEOs of companies, like what were the kind of gestures they would make, and how would they assert themselves in a room, or how would they manipulate the aesthetics of a normative power for their own benefit, and just try to kind of pick them apart. And so all of these things kind of came together in a way to create the piece. And I don't know if we answered any questions, I think we probably just raised more questions with it, but it was, yeah, it was a collaborative effort and very enjoyable. And I could probably go on and on talking about it, but I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm trying to rush. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's great, thanks. Maybe you could just very briefly talk about the kind of the content of it, like what kind of unfolded, I suppose, when people went to see it.
So it was staged as a kind of operetta. And it kind of unfolded in a way like kind of almost like a scene from within a greater narrative that, you know, it's kind of the scope of the project could have exploded in a much more complex way, but obviously we had some restraints. So the narrative was sort of loosely about a boardroom, kind of playing on Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove, where they have that brilliant set around the huge globe table, and exploring how these images of power, where we have this kind of nexus, this kind of central space, they become these kind of elusive spaces of governance that seem so inaccessible to us. And it's the kind of place where we tend to feel disconnected from governance, I think, in that kind of centralized Western political way. And so, yeah, that was kind of the main focus. And then looking at how the power dynamics of where you have a leader and a series of kind of sub leaders. Can't even think of the word. And how they interact and what is their dialogue in this kind of space. But because we were using movement, we were kind of exploring the language of movement and how specific gestures can be used to reinforce to reinforce power in a kind of non-discursive way. And yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't think we played with it as this kind of as an exploration of potential matriarchies or potential images of female power, but I think there were no particular conclusions with it. I think it was opening up that grey area of power that was really interesting for all of us.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. And I'm sure we'll come back round to some of that when we get into the kind of conversation. So now Sriwhana Spong will just talk a little bit about her performance practice, I think, as well. Again, probably going to focus on one piece mainly, I believe, but maybe one or two. So over to you, Sri.
I just had a quick question for Harriet, though.
Yeah, go for it.
Harriet, who was singing? Were they singing, or were they lip syncing? Or?
Yeah, so Helen Noir, who's an opera singer and a DJ, and a composer. So we worked together, and she wrote a beautiful, very kind of spooky score for the piece. And actually, interestingly, so her day job was working as a legal secretary for a law firm. So she brought her own experience of working in this very kind of suited and booted environment where she was very, very present for that kind of like corporate aesthetic that she'd been surrounded by. So she kind of brought that into the music, and she wrote a small libretto as well that she sang for like the kind of second act of the piece.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, seeing the still images just makes me want to hear it as well.
It's on Vimeo.
Okay. Oh yeah. So the work that I'm going to talk about, I guess, is it's this kind of ongoing project, and it doesn't actually have a name. I'd like to name it, but it's basically an ongoing series of instruments that the first instrument I made to explore the idea of ombak, where you have it comes from the traditional Indonesian, Japanese and Balinese gamelan, where you have two metallophones that are kind of identical, but one's pitched about 7 hertz higher than the other, so that when you play them both together, you get this kind of like wave. I mean, I'm not a musician, so I'm not very good at the science of the thing, but it's kind of like this oscillating wave where it's kind of like wah, 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 and it's like this kind of body that oscillates between the two instruments. And so the first instrument A, is this metallophone. Maybe you can see it better in image 2. So basically one of these is pitched slightly higher than the other. And this is, instrument A for, in brackets, Centonia. So each instrument is named after somebody who is a friend or someone who I talk about my work with, or a collaborator. Antonia is, Lucy, maybe if you go down to the images, sorry, thank you, keep going, sorry. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. I think probably at the end. Yeah, right. The next one, this one, 14. So that's Centonia. And so the first time it was played, this is in Berlin at the Dard Gallery, and she composed a score. She's a New Zealand composer, and she composed a score for it. And so this was the first instrument, and it was played, and I had Benny Ord, who's a New Zealand dancer based in the UK, a dancer and a choreographer. He choreographed a piece with MJ Harper. So maybe if you go up to image 13, Lucy, thank you. So Antonia played this instrument where, they're similar, but then the slight kind of difference creates this oscillating wave, and so the choreography worked with that idea. So the instrument kind of, I guess, enabled the space where Antonia could create a score for it, and she created a score by chance, and then where Benny could choreograph this piece and him and MJ could perform it. So and then from there, the instruments kind of grew. I worked with Will Kinshard, who's in Berlin, to make the instrument. It was kind of quite a feat of design. I kind of don't quite know how he pulled it off, but he did an amazing job. And then, then it kind of grew. And then maybe, Lucy, if you scroll up, maybe back to this number 2. Oh yeah, number 7, sorry. So this is the second one that I made, which was instrument B, and this is, and in brackets, Vivian, and it was named after Vivian Wang, who you see here performing it in Singapore. And the dress I made is kind of based on this kind of like pseudo-scientific transfer, or of the note of each note into a color reference. And then, so maybe, Lucy, maybe image 3, thank you. So this is three of the instruments now, and this was at the Govett Brewster in New Plymouth. So there's like a gong plate, and it has, every time it's installed, it has foliage attached to it, that when you hit the gong, the branches hit against it and kind of distort the notes and also rattle and the leaves fall off. There's some chimes that are made from cast French fries that Stefan there is playing. So I had these instruments shown in the show in New Zealand, and this band called Te Coolies from Auckland travelled down and played the instruments. And so generally the instruments, I guess, they sit in the show quite as silent objects, and then there's this moment where they get played, and that kind of where I hand them over to the musicians to basically do what they want with them. So Te Coolies in this iteration set up pedals, distortion pedals, and you can see the microphone under the metallophone. And it was quite funny, like they had decided when they were driving down, I mean, I've known these guys for years, when they were driving down to New Plymouth, they decided they weren't going to treat the objects like artworks. So they weren't going to tell me, but basically they were going to treat them as they would their instruments. So when they started playing, they kind of like, Stefan picked up the chimes and was like banging it around, and it was quite like they really kind of took hold of these objects, which was really great. Like this kind of, I guess, process of giving something up to somebody else to use how they want. And then they also came, I showed some of these instruments plus another one I made in Bristol, and they came over, they were doing a gig in Europe, so they came over to play it. But basically, I guess the idea with these instruments is it's kind of based on this idea in the Balinese gamelan, where traditionally it doesn't work the same now, but traditionally each village would have a slightly different pitch, so you couldn't take one instrument from one village and play it in the gamelan of another village. And so I quite liked this idea of this real intimacy, or this particular place is created via sound and community and history and shared knowledge, and this real intimacy that is kind of created between people and place and sound. So I guess for me, because I kind of, so this became like my kind of personal village, or it's my kind of personal orchestra that kind of traces place and collaboration and people that I love and who I work with. And yeah, and then it also kind of, it's able to open up and scatter and kind of be pulled together. So image one is me, it's a performance that I also did at the Pump House in London, but it was the kind of older performance I'd done, and I kind of reconfigured it to incorporate the gongs. So then these instruments kind of also get pulled into other things where they didn't necessarily kind of, yeah. So, yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. I think like there's one of the things that I love about your this kind of building up of a library of instruments, Sri, is I suppose that it's because it's like a project that's going on over time. It kind of sits, I suppose, silently in some respects, and then is punctuated by these moments where you either add to the collection or the orchestra, or you bring people in to kind of activate it. And this idea of it's then kind of sitting between sculptural objects, because I mean certainly things like the chimes, the kind of French fry chimes, and to a certain degree the gong as well, when they're in the gallery space, they certainly don't necessarily immediately strike you as being like musical instruments. So the idea that they really do become activated and only really get revealed as instruments once somebody else comes in and uses them in that way, I think is really interesting. But I mean, I don't know if you've got any questions immediately, Harriet, or we can kind of go on to talking quite broadly about a topic that I think is a part of both of your practices.
One question that came to mind actually was, I was curious where the instruments are now, just because I really like what you said about how the musicians pick them up and treat them not as these kind of precious art objects, but as tools, as something that they would collaborate with themselves, and kind of, yeah, giving them agency as collaborators as well. And I was curious where the instruments are now, and if they have a life of their own.
Well, I mean, it's funny, they're kind of scattered. I've got some up in the storage up there. There are actually some bells that I want to rework. Some are in storage back in Auckland. One is like broken in like the storage of the Auckland Art Gallery, because it was a glass bell that I made that got smashed because, bless them, an audience member thought it was interactive.
think that's kind of great.
Yeah.
Maybe, it's got a beautiful story to it, I think.
I mean, I do, like, so I want to, the gallery very kind, well, as that, they had them remade, but now I've got this broken bell that I want to kind of work on and maybe turn into something else. So we'll see. But yeah, they're kind of set kind of in boxes in different places at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, so I think one thing that we've been kind of chatting about a bit between the three of us is this idea of kind of structures and architecture, which I think is quite a key point in both of your practices. I mean, you're both kind of interested in these sort of in-between spaces or gaps in structures or architectures of power in particular, and how those things can be maybe revealed or investigated a bit or opened up in some way. So, I mean, for example, Sriwhana, you are very interested in like language and grammar in particular as a kind of structural thing of power that feeds into your research in terms of like medieval mystics, mostly medieval or all medieval? Sorry, I should know this, but
No, I just think like I've been mainly concentrating on or just looking at texts by women written between like the 12th century and the 16th century. Basically because I guess that's the kind of, or Michel de Citeaux talks about it as the high point of the style before, and Teresa of Avila kind of represents for him like the kind of pinnacle of the style, which gets kind of, I guess, blown out by the light of enlightenment and rationality.
You actually speak more about Teresa d'Avila, because I think your piece about her and her as well as a historical figure is so fascinating.
Oh. Yeah, I well, I guess that, I mean, I was interested, Harriet, in seeing your kind of, these kind of science fiction architectures, because I felt like that work that I made, so I was interested in, I was asked to do this work, commissioned to do this work for the Edinburgh Arts Festival, and so I did a site visit, and most obvious thing you could actually choose, or the most cliched thing you could choose to make a work about would be the castle in Edinburgh, right? But as my writing tutor Lisa Robertson once said, cliches are cliches for a reason. So I was thinking about the castle and this kind of very obvious structure of central power, and I was thinking about Teresa's book, The Interior Castle, which is this, she wrote it in 1577, and it's this interior journey where she writes, it's a guide or an itinerary that she writes for her sisters to enable them, and I guess into a process of prayer. She calls it kind of entering themselves so that they can gain self-knowledge. It's almost quite a like proto-psychoanalytical kind of process as well, and linked to, I guess, contemporary meditative practices. But what I like, there was like one line in the epilogue which is like so kind of beautiful, and she says, and this is for you, my sisters, even though you're like enclosed and your enclosures are so small, you can enter this castle at any time without being looked at by your supervisors, and delight in it at any hour, which in Michel de Citeaux translates that as revel, which I really love, but I haven't found anyone else who's translated it as revel. But I just thought it was so kind of beautiful, this idea that an interior space or an interior world or an interior architecture is just important as an external space. But then also, it's not just a space that's contemplative, it also for her had very real kind of, it also enabled her to act in the outside world as well. So there was a kind of correlation between contemplation and action, is my reading anyway. But yeah, but it's also this very, like, it's kind of like, it's made out of crystals. So it's very kind of beautiful, and it feels very science fiction or futuristic.
Yeah. It's quite radical for the time as well, or the place, I guess. I don't know. I feel like it's one of the earliest texts in the West that talks about like a kind of subjectivity or a very kind of reflective practice in that way.
Yeah.
Interior view.
Yeah, definitely. There's this really good book, actually, Teresa My Love by Julie Kristeva, who kind of, I guess, as a psychoanalyst herself, she kind of argues that it's not a psychoanalytical practice, and it's not like, but it's doing a very similar thing and kind of using language to kind of uncover the interior world and the unconscious. But, you know, also within a religious framework, which for me is very difficult as well, but yeah.
Harriet, I wonder if you maybe want to talk a bit about your interest in, I suppose, the kind of psychology of contemporary architecture in relation to that, because I know that you're particularly, I suppose, late 20th century, early 21st century architecture is something that we've talked a bit about, and the kind of revealing power structures of those types of building, or the way they reveal the system that makes them, rather than, and what that says about the system, I suppose. I'm trying not to say too much about what we talked about when I ask you the question. So yeah, do you want to just maybe touch on that?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I've got kind of two threads that I'm looking at the moment. One is looking at assembly halls and these kinds of images, like the UN Security Council or the European Union Council chamber, which we've seen a lot of, I guess, in the last few years of the news, which has got this really bright room with this quite ornate ceiling, and it's got rings and rings of seating with a kind of central core for whoever's chairing the meeting. But so yeah, I was kind of researching these kinds of like stratified architectures, which are very much kind of the image of what we consider governance to be at the moment. I think it's a very kind of contemporary structure of how we deal with politics and decision making. And then the other thread I've been looking at is, and I think this is kind of taking me a bit further, and it's one of the images, this image that, if you can, I can't see myself because I've hidden my self view, but this image behind me, and the image in the war room, which is a Zaha Hadid render of, well, the one in the war room was an image from a gallery in West London called the Rocker Gallery, which is actually a bathroom showroom. But I find Zaha Hadid and that kind of era of, and well, it's quite contemporary, I guess, still as well, of architectural research really fascinating, because it's this kind of, it's hard, it's like there is this feeling, I think, with within architectural education and within architectural practices a lot, where you are designing the future and that rests on your shoulders. And so they have this quite godlike, quite powerful position in lots of ways. And I think that can come through in their architectural design methodologies. So Zaha Hadid, who is such a fascinating character to me, because she's brilliant and difficult and complicated, and I think that's what makes her so interesting. And she kind of did a lot of research into what is called parametric design, which is using mathematics and algorithms to create structures and shapes in which then are translated into spaces and design. So like the Sackler Gallery, what's it called? Cafe at the side of the building. That's a very good example of her design, and it's beautiful. Not always functional, and there's a lot of criticism about her functionality. And actually, if you scratch the surface of what functionality really means, it's often about the experience of being a human being and doing what you need to do in that space. And so there's this kind of disjuncture there between the experience of a space, who you are, how you feel in a space, how it affects your sensibilities, and what the image is. What does it look like? How impressive is it? And this is kind of the issue with parametricism, and also using this kind of mathematical logic becomes also quite problematic in my opinion, because it rests on this very empirical, very kind of rational perspective, even like what Sri was saying about how Teresa d'Avila's work was kind of pre-Enlightenment, and there was, you know, this period of the Enlightenment where everything had to be boiled down to this rational empirical standard, and this is kind of what parametricism seems to be doing. It's kind of that it's trying to find the perfect, it's trying to find the kind of perfect average of space, which leaves no kind of space for outliers or anomalies or kind of weirdness. And I think it's just fascinating because I'm also attracted to it. Like, I find it really sexy, but whether but it's still, I can see there's a problem with that as well. So I think, yeah, I'm always kind of, I love those moments of tension and conflict between the way I feel about an architecture or the way I feel about a space, which is why I've, kind of gravitated towards it and just trying to kind of understand it, and how it's, a lot of these kind of, this parametric design has kind of, it's begun to form how we think the future will look. And that's always, I feel like, you know, as with like science fiction and a lot of kind of what we call kind of like futuristic design, I guess, we project the future and then we enact it. We enact what we think is going to happen, and so we kind of manifest our own projections, kind of telling our own future. And so it's kind of, I think it's really important to critique those kinds of practices, because they do begin to inform how we live.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose like there's a good point to move on to something else that I wanted to talk to you both about, which is around collaboration, in terms of that that idea, I suppose, of architecture seems to have quite a hierarchical structure, I suppose, with the, you know, this idea of the kind of cult of the genius, or someone at the top who's designing the future. I mean, I suppose that's been, there is examples of architectural firms that I suppose are moving away from that. I mean, the obvious one that I can think of is like Assemble. But I suppose when thinking about collaboration, and also I suppose thinking about that idea of the cult of the genius, maybe you can, you know, what I wanted to talk to you about collaboration, try not to get into too much of the kind of practicalities and logistics of working in collaboration, but thinking through collaboration as a methodology, I suppose, and what it means to collaborate with someone or something, you know, not necessarily a group of performers, but you know, we've talked in previous meetings about collaborating with objects or other things to try and think about them in a different way. So, I mean, you obviously both have a kind of research forms a fairly substantial part of your practice in terms of trying to understand these different fields that you're interested in. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how collaboration works in terms of your research, but also obviously in terms of bringing different perspectives and working with performers and things like that. Sri, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I guess it's like when I came out of a department at art school in New Zealand, which was the intermedia department, where it was kind of like, we're quite rogue, and we were basically given a bunch of cameras and a space, and it was very like, we kind of would make films together, and we'd kind of make sound works together and performances, and there was already this kind of element of kind of what skills people could bring, or you know, we'd make costumes, row a boat out to this island called like Rat Island and film a piece there. And so I think my very kind of, like what's kind of like fundamental or elemental to my practice is this kind of shared energy. And yeah, I mean, I like when I make my films, I know how to use the various cameras that I use myself, and I like using the iPhone as well because I can film myself and very intimately. But I also love kind of, I guess, when I work with other film people, what they bring, the knowledge that they bring. Yeah, I guess it's about kind of working with different knowledges, breaking up an idea of authorship. For me as well, I guess I've been thinking about collaborating in terms of these kind of more like historical texts as well, because I'm not a historian, and it's like, as an artist, it's very tricky not to kind of, well, for me, it's very hard. You know, you have to be careful not to project things onto these documents. You have to be kind of like, how do you give them the space to, because also these like documents are written at a time that's like a completely different world. Like it's completely removed from any, like it's a totally different reality system. You know, they were very different bodies. So there's kind of this acknowledgement that I'm approaching these objects from a very different place. I'm reading them, I'm translating them. I'm never going to get it right. So there's this kind of space of almost negotiation with them, or yeah, which I feel like is kind of in the same way how I would collaborate with people as well. Like it's kind of like, yeah, it's about kind of allowing the parameters of my own practice to kind of dissolve, and someone else's kind of knowledge and practices to kind of enter. And yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in the dissolving of boundaries and the kind of the spaces that open up between things.
I mean, I think that idea of translation is an interesting one in terms of thinking about collaborating with like a document or you know, some kind of non-conscious being that you can't actually have a actual conversation with, you know, because I suppose translation is this very I mean, I suppose to me it sort of feels like quite a kind of subtle dark art, I suppose, but you know, there's definitely something in there where you're putting part of yourself into it and then taking a part from this other thing or this document and kind of fusing those things together in some way. So, you know, that to me really feels like a very genuine collaborative kind of way of working with something that you don't actually have a conversation with.
But I think, you know, I think in a way you do have a weird you are having this weird conversation with these texts, like especially like because a lot of these these texts were made also to be kind of spoken, and a lot of these texts were at their kind of first point of language. It was spoken and then written down by a scribe. But it was like, yeah, making the film about the interior castle, so much of her text was roving around in my head on a daily basis, and I was kind of thinking through her words. Like it's kind of this weird thing where it's like you speak out the words on the page, you're kind of speaking out these words that have kind of been in her, and actually there's this in the last part of the film, I had this Javanese singer sing this poem called the Boimantaka, this 12th century Javanese poem, where the poet is praying that his poem becomes a temple in which the God of love can enter and dwell. So it's kind of, I guess, relating it to Teresa's architecture as well, where it's almost like by entering the text, you enter her itinerary, but you're also entering her interior. So there's this very kind of intimate, yeah, I mean, it's not, it kind of goes beyond collaboration, but it goes into other things. But yeah, sorry.
No, it's great. It's all super interesting. You know, I think that this idea of like embodiment, I suppose, is a big part of that. And Harriet, I mean, like in terms of the war room in particular, I suppose it would be interesting to know a bit about the process, because it feels like there was quite a lot of different people that were part of that. I mean, you talked about a kind of production team, and you know how you worked with, just speaking about embodiment just then. I mean, how did you work with the performers, particularly because whilst presumably they had kind of characters that they were fulfilling, they were also quite, it was also quite kind of abstract in some ways. It wasn't like a, you are this type of person, but it was a bit kind of looser than that, I suppose.
Yeah. So, I mean, just kind of taking it one step back a bit with regards to like how I would was beginning to approach the project right in the beginning. And it's actually quite similar to what Sri said as well about coming from a film background. Like, I've had a million jobs in my life, and actually I spent a lot of time in my 20s doing working on like TV and film sets, and it's a very interesting and very different way to artistic kind of practice and production in that way, because it's very much a collaborative effort, but also hierarchical and particular. So everyone has their role, and you don't really deviate from your role. Saying that, it's a very intimate process, and say you're on a shoot for days or weeks on end with the same people, you get to know them really well, and you have this strange bond that is it feels kind of, it's sort of, you don't really get it anywhere else. Same with theatre, I think as well. So I think I already had that in my mind of like how you work collaboratively. So I kind of brought that to the table a bit. And so we workshopped really how we were going to approach the characters. So with Sister, the choreographers, we kind of brought a series of gestures to the dance studio, and kind of everyone played around with them. And we kind of, I mean, we were using, in terms of like becoming characters or bringing yourself to the character, or how working with an abstraction of a character, it was more about kind of embodying the sense of power that you might have with this gesture. So offering it that as the form of embodiment for the dancers. So like, it was really about like, we kind of practice how you would feel if you were the head of state. How would that manifest in your body? And it was quite, you know, bringing that kind of like role play to the workshop was great, because I think most of us will never play those characters in our lives. You never know. But so that was a very interesting way of kind of like criticizing, or having a critical approach to power through performativity and embodiment. So that was a really interesting experience, and I think the dancers were brilliant and got so much out of it, as far as I know, what they told me. But no, but it was great, and actually, because we enjoyed working together with so much, and because we had this kind of collaborative bond that you get from that sense of production, we just decided to kind of continue. And so we took the process beyond the show, and Rachel Davis and I wanted to continue working with the dancers. So we set up I don't know if set up's the right word, but we gave it a name, the company, to kind of give it this kind of enclosed feeling, so that or a sense of identity for the group to kind of feel part of. And we did another performance together, which felt it was actually much more collaborative in that way, because it wasn't like my work, it was very much like, this is a collaborative project, which we had kind of roles, but there was no central authorship to the project. And that was a really interesting experience for me, because I had to kind of relinquish any idea of, like the artist, or a sense of ego, or yeah, any kind of like personalized authorship. And it was really beautiful, because you get to experience a different kind of intimacy with the people you're working with, and you have to trust each other and listen to each other. And yeah, and it can be hard, but it was really generative, and really, it was a great process. And we're always applying for funding and never getting it, so we're going to keep applying for funding to continue, I think.
You should, for sure. Okay, so I think we can open it up to questions now. So
you want to say something?
Oh, it was just, Harriet, I was just going to ask if if the group had ever performed in one of these spaces that you're so interested in, like have you ever had the chance to perform something in one of these spaces? Or I'd just be interested in terms of what that would do to gesture. And
the last performance we did was at this place called Plexel, which is it's called like an innovation center, and it houses all these kind of tech startups, and very kind of interesting place anyway. And it's on the Olympic Park site. And so we collaboratively responded to the architecture of the Olympic Park, and in particular looking at this kind of notion of public and private space and how that can affect your body. And so the dancers kind of brought a lot of their experience of walking around the area to the choreography, and then Sister also, who were working on the project, they kind of helped interpret that into a kind of into a choreographic piece. So yeah, it wasn't a parametric Zaha Hadid but it was definitely a response to the architecture of the Olympic Park, which I guess, though it might not be well, actually, I mean, there is the Zaha Hadid swimming pool, so I guess she was there in a way.
Oh, you should have done something in the swimming pool.
Yeah, true. I mean, we tried. One day.
Yeah.
I just need to send a letter.
Get that funding for a synchronized swimming routine.
Yeah, I'd love that. That would be amazing. Yeah. Okay, next project.
Okay, so we can keep chatting, but if anybody's got any questions, feel free to type them in, and I can read them out for you. I was going to say something then. Just thinking through like intimacy, I suppose, and how that might be changed by, I suppose we're all rethinking what closeness means these days. Hence this kind of slightly strange format that we're using at the moment. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, certainly in respect to performances and this project in particular, is how do you address the idea of intimacy through performance in a post-pandemic world? And obviously that's a very big question, but I think actually, it's actually very relevant, because I think, one of the, you can argue that one of the reasons why performance has become so prevalent in the last 10, 15, 20 years in contemporary art is because that there's been a kind of withdrawing of close physical closeness in the world in general. I think there's I was reading an article the other day that was talking about how millennials are don't really have the same training, if that's the right word to use, in terms of like having like one-to-one actual conversations with strangers, because there's not the same need to fill time by, say you're at a bus stop, people would often just talk to another person that was at the bus stop, but now everybody's obviously invested in their phones. Even things like dating apps and internet dating and things has kind of removed that idea that you go up to someone and you talk to them. And I think, so maybe, I don't know what your thoughts are. That was a bit of a ramble, but I don't know if you guys have any thoughts in terms of what that means for performance in the future, and like audience and performer, and all of those kind of machinations, I suppose, and how that might look.
I mean, my first response, I think, is that, like, I think we have to be careful with how we frame the evolution of intimacy with technology, because I think I don't ever want to say that, like, we've, you know, that whether we like it or not, I think digital technology is here to stay. So I think we have to adapt and not kind of feel nostalgic for the time when we were together, because I mean, there's also new forms of intimacy that have come about through this, and we can connect with people in different worlds, and we've got huge movements. I mean, Black Lives Matter movement has been helped and facilitated by the internet and by that, and so much amazing information is available to us. So I'm really grateful for that new form of potential intimacy, I think, that digital technology can bring about. But saying that as well, yeah, we still need touch and physicality and being with each other in space, and I'm sure everyone misses that so much, and I'm like, misses just standing in a room with more than 5 people in it. So I think, yeah, there has to be a way in which we kind of have both of those ways of being together at the same time. And I don't have the answer to that, but when it comes to performance, I guess it's about, I know we spoke earlier on about like an ethics of care when it comes to an audience, because I mean, now with a show and with a performance or with a public space, like, people's health is literally the most important thing at the table in that scenario. So that's something that we probably wouldn't have even considered last year, you know, the health of the audience is the most important thing. So it's an interesting and again, probably quite intimate then experience for everyone to be a part of. So yeah, I hope to see a very more considerate and caring approach to performance spaces in whatever way that might be. And institutions need to facilitate that and do what they can, and make sure that it is a priority, I think.
Yeah,
to have an ethics
absolutely.
of care and be slow and be calm, like, not to roll out a million programs, and to really have that as the most important thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's this funny thing where, and I really need to test it, but I have this, like, I guess thinking about this kind of, I need a better word for it, but this kind of magic of bodies that happens in a space when there's a performance or when there's a lot of bodies, like the particular energy that kind of bodies give off, and, you know, you have in like kind of like concerts or gigs, or as a performer you can actually feel. And I don't want to romanticize that at all, but it's, I guess I'm just really curious to see how things like that, I think purely like just coming from, I guess, my practice, how that might change. But there's something that happens with bodies in a space.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think Zoom meetings are great, but I mean, I can't tell you how much I feel like more I would get done, or more we would get done if there was, like, you know, a group of people who just sat around a table. You know, you do tend to be a bit more productive because there's lots of things that each other give off, and you know, little signals of communication that are kind of cut out from something like a Zoom meeting. But who knows, maybe they'll create some sort of platform that engages with that a bit more. We've got a couple of questions, so I just want to do these before we sign off. So I think this is Kate, but it might be Lucy, I'm not sure. So she's got a question about music, and they're just wondering whether the arrival of music, so Harriet, with you at like an opera or an operetta, and Sri with your orchestra, was that like almost coincidental? So, for example, Harriet, was it more about the power structure and elitism, and for Sri, was it more about the translation of place and meaning? And if that's the case, what role did the music itself take on in your practice more broadly, as it's largely being created by other bodies?
I mean, for me, it was about storytelling. So I use music as a way to communicate the narrative, and yeah, it was very much about driving the narrative of the piece for me. And also because my initial research was, so the reason I ended up doing an opera was because the project I'd done before was sort of it was a bit more focused on the subject of the opera as an art form in its own self, and how it can, it's a fascinating art form because it's also fucking weird as well, like for my contemporary uneducated brain, I guess. So yeah, I find it fascinating, but later on I kind of moved away a bit from that, because also it's such a big and it's an expansive and complex and expensive art form. So I don't think I was about to build a career in it. Yeah, so I ended up using it more as a narrative tool. Yeah.
I think for me, it's difficult because I feel like music has always accompanied me. Like I'm not a musician, and but I danced, so it's like music was always is kind of always next to you, or you're in music when you're dancing, so there's always choice about what music to choose. Then I was in a band where I didn't really know how to play my instrument, but it was more about being with the girls that I was in the band with, who were really good musicians. And then making film. Like for me, when I make film, the sound for me is like 70% of the image of the film, actually. Like I'd say it's kind of like, or maybe like 40% image, 60% sound. So I work with really amazing people. Francis Duncan, Ricardo Emery, Owen Pratt, and I feel like I've missed somebody and I'm really sorry, but they're like really incredible people that have something that they bring to the work, and they bring this knowledge and they bring their kind of concepts in this different medium. And I'm quite obsessed with how they translate my image and my ideas into this totally different medium. And it's this trust. So I think the orchestra, just like, I don't quite remember how it came about, but it's just part of this being alongside this other medium in this very intimate but also distanced way as well.
Yeah, I guess in a way, like Sri, like you said, you've got a dance background and like film and media, and so like with all the kind of artistic practices that aren't object based, you often are circling around several modes of practices that kind of come together as like a single project, and so their sound kind of always factors in that way. Like I was in like a dance school when I was really young for a long time, and it's just so ingrained in my way of creating work, just because it just feels it's such a normal thing now. I think I've normalized the idea of as a kind of, as music and sound as just part of a production, although I think I've not been that conscious of that, and it's interesting to think of it as its own thing. And what would it look like if you removed that, or gave more energy to it, I guess.
No, I mean, it's interesting to think about it, because I haven't really, but I've also made instruments that are made to be activated during a show. So there's almost this kind of need to, even when a show is silent or doesn't have music and kind of sculpt, like it is kind of the room is a room of maybe sculptures or paintings that I've done, there's still this kind of need to bring sound into the space. I don't know.
Mm.
Yeah, but the relationship between you know, bodies and sound is just, it's hard to get away from. I think if you're a performer, I think it's just will be an enduring tension, I guess. One of my favorite works, which I discovered halfway through I was doing the War Room, and discovered it to be like just a better version of what I'd done, is a dance work by Crystal Pite called The Statement, and she is choreographed to a script, and it's the whole soundtrack is just it's a conversation in an office about some workplace conflict. It's not really ever discussed what it is. It's very vague, but the choreography is these very, very like precise, very familiar contemporary work gestures that follow just the recording of the conversation. And it's fascinating the way that like the relationship between body and sound, but kind of sound as spoken word or something other than music.
Yeah, I mean, that was something I really liked about your the opera, was this like focus on hand gestures, like and these kind of like, yeah, how kind of powerful actually these very small gestures are, in the way you were able to kind of distill that and make them, that they seemed like such a feature.
Yeah, I've been keeping an archive of every image of Sheryl Sandberg I come across, because she's like, I just find her as well such a problematically interesting character. I take a screenshot of her hands. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with them yet, but I've just been keeping this archive of them because there is this very particular way of communicating with your hands that kind of, it's a bit more subliminal and a bit more kind of subtle, but it's still very intentional at the same time, and it's still communicating something quite potentially sinister if you're Sheryl Sandberg, but yeah, interesting.
So there's just one more question from Daphne Simons, who wanted to know, Sri, about whether your instruments have connections to existing designs, or are they like free-form deviations from general percussion forms?
Oh, that's a good question. It's kind of a mix of both. So the bell plate is something that's already in exist, like is already made by, and I feel terrible because his name has just, I've just blanked on his name, but he's in Bristol. He's a cymbal maker, and that's, I'm really sorry, but that, so the bell plate is one of his designs, but then others like this is like a prototype. So I made these hand bells, which is kind of like a bronze cast at the inside of my hand. It was kind of meant to be a joke on hand bells, but they kind, so that's kind of like, I don't know. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like a play on something, but that's my own kind of version. So it's yeah, it's a combination. It's a combination.
Well, that's all the questions. So unless either of you have anything else you'd like to add.
Don't think so.
No, okay. Well, thanks so much for coming on and sharing like that conversation. It was super interesting, and I'm really looking forward to like developing the projects a bit more with you. Now we can start pushing on with that, and yeah, you can go out and get in the sun and have a beer or something. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and keep an eye on Draft. We'll have some more talks and podcasts and things coming up soon.
Thank you
Right.
so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sri, for sharing your work with us.
Oh, thanks, Harriet. Bye. Thanks, Ned.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.